this episode, we take a look at some forgotten toys from the 80s that paid respects to our service men and women. And ninjas. Lots and lots of ninjas. So, stick around. Hello, fellow dorks and dorkettes, and welcome to Plastic Ghosts. My name's Rob, and this is the show where we talk about forgotten toys. Toys that have become ghosts of their former selves, that are rarely remembered, and if they are, they're usually dismissed and jeered and, made to not feel good. And guess what? Around here in the laundry room, we like to make toys feel good. I hope that didn't sound as weird as it sounded. Anyway, in this episode, we will be talking about forgotten 80s military toys. And what I mean by that are toys that took a healthy inspiration from G.I. Joe, and also ones that are completely different but have a military motif to them. And I hope there's no miscommunication on what I'm trying to talk about, because military toys sounds very sterile, very... I don't know. It just doesn't have a nice ring to it. But honestly, I couldn't find a better way to describe what these toys are. The origin of military toys dates back to the early 1900s. Before that, a lot of military strategists would use maps with little figures, and this kind of morphed into a plaything for children. It wasn't until 1930 when the Little Green Army Man burst upon the scene and was a cultural hit. We will fast forward to 1982 when Hasbro's G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, hit the shelves. Now, Hasbro's previous line of G.I. Joe figures that were released in 1964 were 12-inch dolls, for lack of a better term, that came with different clothes to change them into and different weaponry and accessories that you could mold them into whatever branch of the military you want, whatever adventure scenario that you want, and the line went strong until it kind of got some blowback from what was happening with the Vietnam War. In 1970, that G.I. Joe toy line moved away from the military themes that it had and turned into adventure team, which made them more of globe-trotting, adventure-seeking men of mystery. They fought everything from giant jungle cats to the Yeti itself. In 1976, the line went dormant, and it wasn't until 1982 that G.I. Joe burst back onto the scene. Now, replacing the 12-inch dress-up adventure team and military themes that it had, it now was all military and scaled down to 3 3/4 inches. Taking the scale size of the very popular Star Wars line by Kenner and the articulation of the very popular Takara toy line Micronauts, G.I. Joe was poised to become a toy sensation. And with that popularity comes a lot of inspiration. Again, on this show, I hate using the word knockoff, ripoff, bootleg, what have you. I just like to think that these toy lines were inspired by G.I. Joe, and we'll leave it at that. So anyway, without further ado and enough of a history lesson, let's get to number 1 on the list. Number 1 on the list is Mattel's Men of Metal, released in 1988. These small, probably 3-inch figures were very reminiscent to the popular Mask figures or Dino Rider figures. They offered very limited articulation, arms, legs, head, and the waist actually moved as well. In total, there were 18 figures released, 14 good guys and 4 bad guys. The 14 different good guys were broken down into 7 different factions, and those factions focused on different branches of the military and action-packed professions like being a SWAT team member or a policeman. Now, the one thing that separated these figures from the ones I mentioned, like Mask or Dino Riders or other ones of that scale, was that they came with a lot of different accessories. And one of those were backpacks with an actual peg, like G.I. Joe, that would go onto its back. You had like the Navy frogmen that came with flippers, an oxygen mask, and an oxygen tank for their back. And they looked pretty cool. But why they have the name of Men of Metal when they're obviously not made of metal was because you got to wear a fictitious medal, an award, where the little dude would slide into it. You see that prominently on the front of the packaging of a little boy sliding his Men of Metal down into his metal to hang out, to go on long walks, to bike, whatever. Unfortunately, I can't find that much information on this toy line. You would think with a huge toy company like Mattel, there would be a lot more talk of this toy line online. And there's not. Now, I don't know why this toy line didn't take off. Maybe it's the year. Maybe 1988 just was a little bit too late to jump on that bandwagon. Maybe it's because they don't really look that super duper great. They kind of look cheap. I mean, yeah, those 4-inch figures, 3-inch figures, whatever size they are pretty cool when done right. And unfortunately, these weren't done that right. But that did not deter Mattel from making a commercial in 1989 for this toy line and spotlighting a really cool figure case troop transport. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the commercial.
Sir, the traitors are taking America! Move out the Men of Metal! Move out the fighter pilots!
Men of Metal, Army specialist you command from your chest.
Move out! Marine! SWAT team!
Experts trained to stop the traitors.
Panic in Detroit! Roll out the armored transport!
These guys are tough.
These guys are Men of Metal!
Transport and figures sold separately. There are 18 different figures in the Men of Metal collection, the army you carry on your chest.
It is always a treat to find a commercial for a forgotten toy. It just solidifies its place in history just a little bit more. Anyway, on to number 2. Number 2 on the list is General Patch and the Evil Enemy, released by Galoob in 1982. Yes, 1982, the same year that G.I. Joe was hitting the shelves. So you wonder where that inspiration came from. Maybe it was totally original. Maybe it was they caught wind that Hasbro was up to something and wanted to strike while the iron was hot. With package art that is reminiscent of the happy-go-lucky propaganda machine from World War II, General Patch looks a lot like G.I. Joe. The same articulation, the same scale, the same molding process. It is uncanny that they came out in the same year. And Galoob reused these molds for their A-Team line a couple years later. From what I can find, there are about 11 figures total, 10 good guys, 1 bad guy, and they actually released 2 different vehicles. They had a patrol boat, which came with a figure, and a jet fighter that came with a figure as well. The one thing from this toy line that I still romanticize about, if you will, were the TNT plungers that they came with. These were awesome. They came with a little strap that you could carry them over the figure's shoulder with a movable plunger that you could pretend that you're blowing up a bridge, blowing up an enemy outpost, blow up anything you wanted. But like I said, it is eerily uncanny that it arrived the same year G.I. Joe did, and it's pretty much a carbon copy. For some reason, I just have this fantasy that there were like corporate spies that were stealing away plans in the middle of the night and running off to other toy companies of saying, look what Hasbro's making, we need to do this. So maybe? I don't know. Sounds kind of cool though. But yeah, these figures kind of, I don't really remember the General Patch or Evil Enemy name, but I remember these figures packaged in different ways and sold under different names, but they had the same type of accessories, the same type of figures. I mean, it's eerie to the point that the General Patch mortar soldier had like the exact same mortar that Short Fuse did. That really trips me out, and I really wish I could find some more history on this toy line. But alas, I could not. Other than It was used later on for the A-Team 3 3/4 figures that came out when that show was at the height of its popularity. Alas, I couldn't even find a commercial for this toy line anywhere out there in the internet ether. So maybe this is truly a plastic ghost. We'll have to wait and see until the next episode when we hop on eBay and see if this figure is still around on the secondary market and how much it goes for. So anyway, that's enough about General Patch. Let's jump on to number 3. Number 3 is Bravo Company, made by Small World Importing in 1989. You kind of have to worry about a toy line that's made by a company called Small World Importing. I mean, that doesn't really scream awesome toys, but you never know. This is not a super awesome toy, but it did have one thing that set it apart from the G.I. Joe mold, if you will, and that is that they were made from metal. These were die-cast action figures, and from what I can see, they had just shoulder articulation, head articulation, but they had jointed knees. I don't know about the hips. Maybe I'll have to do some research and see. But anyway, yeah, these were very reminiscent of the Sergeant Rock figures that were made by Remco, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But yeah, there were 6 figures total, and they were just pretty much generic army men with various accessories like bazookas and machine guns. The only one that's kind of a standout, and I'm not sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy, was the one that was inspired by Snake Eyes. And there were plenty that took inspiration from Snake Eyes back in the day. This guy, though, kind of just is wearing a ski mask and a black outfit. I guess he couldn't afford the goggles or faceplate or sword or anything, but at least he gets points for trying. One thing that I really adore about this toy line is the packaging. I love the comic book inspired artwork on it, and the characters really look intriguing and awesome in that comic book art style. Unfortunately, that coolness does not come through with the die-cast action figure that they produced. Like most plastic ghosts, and in this case die-cast ghosts, which sounds pretty cool, there was no commercial or cartoon or comic book or anything attached to this toy line, so it was just thrown out on the shelves, feast or famine. And unfortunately, famine took hold. On to number 4 on the list, and that is Military 1, made by Porto Play in 1982. Yeah, another one from 1982. Let's see how this one fares. Military 1 had a very unique package. It was a giant number 1 with a little bubble on it with the figure. Now, these figures did not have any code names or any defining characteristics to them. They were just Army men and Navy men and what have you. Now, these took a large inspiration from Kenner's Star Wars with its very limited articulation. Head, arms, legs. Nothing fancy. These seem like the evolution of the Little Green Army Men that I mentioned earlier, because with a very drab and lackluster paint scheme and lack of any real details, these would fit right at home with Little Green Army Men if they were scaled up to 3 3/4 inch. There were 8 figures in total, and you had a scuba guy, a Navy guy, an Army guy, so on and so forth. And they each came with one accessory, usually a bazooka or machine gun. Unfortunately, Porto Play did not pay top dollar for their corporate spy like Galoob did in 1982. So all they got wind of was Hasbro is making an Army Man toy, and they jumped on that. And yeah, it kind of shows. These looked rushed to production. The only thing really defining about them was the packaging, which looked kind of eye-catching. Unfortunately, the figures inside the packaging weren't that eye-catching. Now, the one figure in the line that kind of stands out to me is the Frogman with his awesome flippers. Now, I've been trying to track down a picture of him in his packaging to see if the flippers were removable or not. I'm kind of guessing they were not, and I'm kind of curious to how the bubble on the pack looked with these large flippers standing off from his body. Anyway, yeah, that is pretty much the neatest one that comes to mind when I think about it. But anyway, Military One, number 1, yay! Anyway, that's Military One made by Porto Play, and at least they have play in their name and not importing. Now, number 5 on the list is kind of an unknown. I know the company that made it, but I do not know the year that it was released. And these are SOS Commandos. Now, SOS Commandos look very similar to a toy I talked about in a previous episode of Toys I Wish I Had When I Was a Kid. And those toys were the Commando toys. Yes, the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, awesome movie, had a toy line. And I believe when that didn't sell, they slapped on a new name, and they kind of removed Arnie out of the picture, but they kept kind of the crazy, futuristic, post-apocalyptic looking villains from it. Again, this is a toy line that has a striking package. God, that sounds bad. Anyway, they came in kind of a horizontal card opposed to a vertical card, and you got to see their weapons lined up. They had a little stand, and the figure was front and center. They had such bright, vivid colors, they kind of really stood out. But again, they weren't very posable. Again, they were a lot like the Kenner Star Wars figures. Arms, legs, head, and that's about it. One of the coolest things about this line, though, were that it had a lot of vehicles. It had a lot of different motorcycles, helicopters, and even a canoe. They even had a larger troop transport, but I think that kind of came out in the 90s because it attached the name Extreme to it. So it was Extreme SOS Commandos. So, with that being said, I don't know if this toy line made its debut in the 90s or in the 80s, but with its ties to an 80s toy line, such as Commando, I'm going that route, at least for most of it. I also want to say that after further inspection, they actually did have more articulation than I first stated. They actually did have knee joints as well. So, that's kind of cool. The arms were still kind of static, but at least you could pose them, you know, crouching and shooting, or riding their motorcycles or helicopters, or whatever. So, an extra point for that. Anyway, this was just a quick list of 5 forgotten 80s military toys. And like I said, I'm not a big fan of just saying military toys, but I could not find a better way to describe what they are, what their theme was. And like I said, I can't just say G.I. Joe inspired toys, because in other lists in the future, there are ones that are totally different than G.I. Joe. Kind of like the Men of Metal in this, that yeah, they may have jumped on the wave of G.I. Joe, but they kind of went their own path. I also want to point out that we will be doing a follow-up episode. Plastic Ghost Busters, hunting for plastic ghosts, what have you. Anyway, we're going to take the search for these forgotten toys to eBay to see if they have a presence on the secondary market and how much they go for. That really intrigues me, and I can't wait to dive in and take a look. Oh, and I'm sorry to say ninjas in the intro, because there weren't any in these toy lines, but we know that they're coming. You couldn't have a military line in the 80s without a few ninjas kicking around. Maybe that's why these 5 toy lines did not go anywhere, because they didn't have a ninja. Did you ever think of that? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Plastic Ghosts. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. If you got something to say, please leave a comment. I love reading them, and I love getting back to everybody. And if you're new around here and you enjoyed this or any of the episodes YouTube is recommending down here, please hit subscribe. And if you hit that little bell icon, you will be notified whenever there's a new episode. So anyway, until next time, thanks for watching. Keep being rad and stay dorky.